publication by Gary Hall and unpacks some of the key ideas laid out in the publication, A Stubborn Fury. For a link to the publication, you can see in the chat box, there will be a link to the PDF. The structure of the event today is the following. After my initial introduction, in which I will touch upon the book's overall argument and obviously introduce the author, Gary Hall, I will then hand over to Gary for a 20-minute presentation. This presentation will be followed by a short conversation between myself and Gary, and then to discuss some of these ideas. The idea is also the presentation we'll put forward before we open the discussion to the floor for your questions and comments. So just before we proceed, there are just some housekeeping notes. The first one is, as you've noticed, we are recording this event. So by joining the meeting, you are consenting to be recorded. If you wish to remain anonymous, please keep your video off and sound muted at all times. You are invited to keep your video on if you feel so during the event, but please stay muted unless invited to speak. Finally, for questions and comments, they can be submitted via two ways. So we have the chat button that you will find on the bottom of the screen, which you can use throughout the event. So write down some questions and comments you might have for Gary. The other possibility is that you can ask questions or share comments by selecting the raise hand option that you will find on the bottom of the screen as well. When prompted to ask the question, please unmute your mic. And this will happen in the Q&A session. In terms of the publication, so A Stubborn Fury is a publication that makes the persuasive argument of intersecting literary and cultural standards with a critique of the bourgeois liberal humanism. It does so by providing a grim analysis of the inequalities in British academy, drawing on the fact that 2/5 of Britain leading people were educated privately, within 1/4 graduating in Oxbridge universities. The book explores how this inequity in development for many years, and as argued by Gary as being kind of a more political program, is reflected in the literary genres and the cult of the figure of the author. Moreover, how cultural standards and literary styles are part of the cultural paradigm informed by racial capitalism and neoliberalism. Hall's work provides a compelling reading where the liberal humanist figure of the author is used as a way to look critically at the state of affairs in British culture, marked, according to the writer, by an aversion to radical and abstract ideas in favor of an uncritical realism and anti-intellectualism. We'll explore a bit more these ideas in our conversation with Gary. But Gary goes on to advocate for a cultural paradigm beyond the eye of the single writer and beyond ontological dualism, where protocols of knowledge production are organized in fixed binaries. So we look forward to Gary's presentation, and without further ado, I would like to introduce necessarily Gary Hall is a critical theorist and media philosopher working in the areas of digital culture, politics, and technology. He's a professor of media at Coventry University, where he directs the Center for Post-Digital Cultures, also part of the Research Institute of Creative Cultures. He's the author of a number of books, including obviously this one, published this year, 2021, but also the Inhumanist Manifesto published in 2017, Pirate Philosophy in 2016, and finally the Uberification of the University also in 2016. So Gary, I hand over to you now. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I got a new laptop recently, and obviously that's not gone very smoothly. So Olga is going to do the technology for me with the slides. Eventually it will happen. You know when they say when you have an accident and your life flashes before your eyes, it would kind of look like this screen with all these people lining up from different stages of it. It's kind of very nice. Okay, so we're on the first page. So I'd like to thank all the people that have put this together. So it's Catherine Thompson-Goodwin, Olga, and especially for doing the slides now, Holly Turpin and Victoria Williams. They've been responsible for organising everything. So the next slide. So a couple of things we need to say first. A bit about the title. The title for tonight's event, as you can see, was adapted from Arturo Escobar's book from 2020. It's Pluriversal Politics. And in it, Escobar asks, can we unlearn the liberal individual in a similar way that we endeavour to unlearn patriarchy, racism, and heterosexism? To make things a little bit more succinct for the title of the event, a little bit more punchy, if you like, the endeavour part was dropped from our title, but I just want to make it clear that unlearning racism and sexism and liberal individualism is, of course, an ongoing process. It's not something that can be achieved once and for all. Okay, so that was the little preliminary thing I wanted to say. Next slide, please. So in the meta-crisis of liberalism, which is a piece that we published at Open Humanities Press in 2017, John Milbank and Adrian Paps insist that while the struggle between left and right that's dominated Western politics for the past half century is being presented as a relationship of opposing positions, there are actually two faces of the same liberalism. Now I want to go a step further than that. I want to argue that actually most politics in the West today is conducted in liberal humanist terms, and that that's the case regardless of whether those involved identify as liberals or socialists or conservatives, libertarians, Marxists, or anarchists. Can you do the next slide? Olga, can we do the next slide? No, we can't. There we go. So something similar can be said about radical anti-humanist and post-humanist theories, of which the most fashionable in recent times have perhaps been new materialism and media archaeology and media ecology. These theories might be positioned as differing from conventional understandings of the humanities, in that they represent a shift away from anthropocentrism and a modernist epistemology based on the separation of human and non-human, subject and object, mind and body, culture and nature. And instead, they champion an approach to the world that destabilizes such ontological dualisms. Next one, next slide. And yet, while anti-humanist and post-humanist theories may write about transgressing the boundary that divides the human from the non-human, be it animal or insect or technology, water, the planet, when it comes to how they themselves work, they remain liberal humanists. Evidence their continued adherence to any number of normative concepts and values that they've inherited from the traditional humanities, such as the individualistic human author, the fixed and finished book, creativity, and copyright. And as I illustrated in a 29 essay called Anti-Bourgeois Theory, with respect to the theoretical literature on the Anthropocene, all their mention of objects and materials and technologies is really just non-human filler, designed to make their liberal humanist ways of being and doing appear otherwise. Next slide, please. So Stubborn Fury is one of two books that I've been working on for Open Humanities Press's new Media Art Right Now series, edited by John Angelinska. And it offers a critique of the bourgeois liberal humanism that dominates contemporary literature and culture. And as I say, include most anti-humanist theory and what Rosie Braidotti refers to as post-human humanity studies in that liberal humanism. And put briefly, what I'm trying to explain in this book is why it's important not just to write non-liberal or anti-bourgeois theory, but actually work and act and think as non-liberal or anti-bourgeois theorists. Next slide, please. And daring us to desire something different like this is not quite as idiosyncratic as it might appear. A number of our most interesting thinkers are already moving us in this direction. So for Amitov Ghosh, if we want to address the climate crisis, then the tradition of the bourgeois literary novel, emerging as it did out of the industrialization of the 19th century, is no longer adequate to the task. Not only does contemporary literary fiction neglect the climate emergency, it's complicit with our dissociation from it, and therefore with our inability to grasp its importance. We need to reinvent the novel, Ghosh insists in his 2016 non-fiction book, The Great Derangement. Got the Italian cover because I quite like it. That's the one on the left. Next slide, please, Olga. So Olga Tokarczuk, to stay with literature, argues along similar lines in The Tender Narrator, the lecture she gave on winning the Nobel Prize in 2018. For Tokarczuk, we need a new literature that would allow us to go beyond the limits of our ego in order to respond to the cacophony of noise generated by the polyphonic first-person narratives that are characteristic of our age. And by the latter, she means the kind of story that narrowly orbits the self of a teller who more or less directly just writes about herself and through herself. No doubt this is why it sometimes feels like just about everyone is writing a memoir today. Tokarczuk continues. We have determined that this type of individualized point of view, this voice from the self, is the most natural, human, and honest. Yet also means building an opposition between the self and the world. Next slide, please. Tenderness, by contrast, is for her a mode of looking that shows the world as being alive, living, interconnected, cooperating with and codependent on itself. So we can see the notion that we need to change our ways of being and knowing and doing is clearly in the air. However, in maintaining that if we actually want to be consistent with an anti or post-humanist approach that conceives the world in radically relation terms, we need to renew serious theory too, including its endorsement of the proprietorial author and copyright and so on. I acknowledge I'm perhaps taking us further away from liberal humanism than even the likes of Ghosh and Tokarczuk are prepared to go just at present. The second book I've been working on, trying to finish, is Masked Media. And this describes some of the alternative, anti-bourgeois, even inhumanist ways of being a progressive scholar or theorist that my collaborators and I are exploring with initiatives such as Open Humanities Press and Photo Mediations, like the Radical Open Access Collective and other projects. Next slide, please. And I'm using the term inhuman as just another way of distinguishing this approach from the liberal humanism of most anti-humanist and post-humanist theory. What's different about the inhumanities is that when it comes to our notions of the author and the book and the copyright, our ways of acting and working, in other words, it actually tries to assume a processual entangled relation between the human and non-human, rather than ignore or otherwise deny it. So there's no such thing as the non-human here in any simple sense, nor the human for that matter. Rather, each is born out of its relation to the other. The non-human is therefore already in the human and vice versa. I guess what I'm hoping we'll do tonight is together develop a little further this critique of Western politics and contemporary culture and serious theory as different aspects of the same bourgeois liberal humanism. The answer to the question of why my collaborators and I want to not only write non-liberal and anti-bourgeois theory, but also work and act and think in terms of it is quite simple. We want to demonstrate how our ways of being and doing can be reimagined in order to help produce a more socially just future, along with, as I say in the book, an appreciation of life and agency and subjectivity that's more plural and diverse and complex than Western-centric liberal humanism. Next question, please. So in the publicity material, I promised I'd answer some questions. I'm going to get to those in a minute. But the reason we want to work like this is because unless we learn to do so, we're going to risk perpetuating the kind of unjust and unequal culture with which many of us are all too familiar. As Stubborn Fury makes clear, it's a culture dominated by the liberal, humanist worldview of healthy, privileged, middle-class white men. to the exclusion of more radically inventive thought, including that of feminists, working class, LGBTQ, Black and global majority writers. So hopefully I've already answered some of the questions I said that we kind of address in the pre-publicity material. There are, of course, a few more that I haven't touched on. For example, why are Oxbridge-educated journalists so obsessed with protecting ordinary people from difficult language? Next slide, please, Olga. It seems ironic to me that in Britain we have a largely public school and Oxbridge-educated section of society repeatedly telling radical theorists and philosophers that we can't do supposedly difficult things because it's this elite section of society who know what the ordinary reader can and cannot understand. It's a case that these theory-averse journalists and media commentators continue to make, despite research showing a long history of self-educated people in Britain, who are perfectly capable of preaching all kinds of supposedly inaccessible material. What this elite are really doing with their continual attacks on difficulty, of course, is protecting themselves and their own privilege from being radically questioned or challenged. Another question I thought I should answer, or that kind of I feel guilty about not having answer, is why am I so rude about Oxbridge in the book? Olga, the next slide, yeah. Thanks. Well, as I say, if mass media, the book I'm trying to finish at the moment, is about some of the inhumanist ways of being a scholar and theorist that my collaborators and I are experimenting with. I Stubborn Fury, with its critique of liberal humanism and its parroting of Tom McCarthy, it's more about why we're doing so. So in this respect, Stubborn Fury is not actually about social mobility and widening access at all. As we know, 7% of the UK population went to public school and less than 1% went to Oxbridge. Yet half of all poets and novelists in Who's Who, anyway, went to public school, and 44% went to Oxbridge. What I'm arguing in the book is that in all the recent debates about the widening of access, there's very little being said about how this state of affairs actively shapes our culture and even our subjectivities. Yes, it's the people who have been through the extremely privileged part of the education system who then get to actually participate in culture, while those who don't go to a fee-paying school and who are thus less likely to be accepted to Oxbridge are in turn less likely, as we can see, to be novelists and poets and so on. Next slide, please. But it's not just a question of access, because the pandemic disrupted schooling last year. An algorithm was used to decide the exam results of A-level students in England. And this algorithm was actually conceived in Coventry at the headquarters of the exam regulator Ofqual in the city. And it's used to decide in advance which schools were successful and which weren't, made clear to many people the bias in the education system against those from less well-off backgrounds. Public schools increasing the proportion of their students achieving top grades twice as much as comprehensive. Oh, it's not just a matter of devising a fairer system for distributing places at public schools in Oxford and Cambridge, say by using a system of quotas, vouchers, or even a lottery to be more inclusive of diversity. It's the public schools in Oxbridge have a particular culture and in part particular values. Consequently, even if more people from a wider range of backgrounds or from Black and global majority or LGBTQ communities were able to go to public schools in Oxford and Cambridge, which might be a decent start, nevertheless, the homogeneous, anti-intellectual, liberal humanists, some would say boring culture that's promoted by these places would still dominate. Next slide, please. As I put in the book, paraphrasing Renée Eddo-Lodge, there'd just be more women and people of colour involved in producing and disseminating that culture, that's all. After the resurgence of Black Lives Matter protests that occurred around the world last year, following the killings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, Eddo-Lodge became the first Black Briton ever to top both the non-fiction paperback and overall UK book charts with why I'm no longer talking to white people about race. However, for me, her book's far more radical than its popularity might suggest. For all, some did find its title challenging and even controversial. This is why I used a quote from Meadow Lodge as an epigraph to the book. I guess a stubborn furious worn attempt on my part to question the standards, to disarticulate, transform, and rearticulate the structural power of our current system. Its common sense, its orthodoxy, what seems self-evident. It's also why the book ends by arguing that it's not just which subjects, which people from which backgrounds and communities that get to write and publish that's crucial. It's also how those subjects do so, how culture and subjectivity are actually performed. I've got just a few more minutes. Next slide, please, Olga. All this raises the question, and a question that I might ask Carolina, and we might discuss in a moment. Can something similar be said about post-war British art in its version of the autonomous modernist artist? If you know, America had people like Rothko and Pollock, but when we think of the post-war artists who are celebrating Britain today, it's people such as Hockney, Bacon, and Freud. Next slide. Who've all focused on the human figure and human portrait. Now, as we know, art plays a vital role in opening up spaces in society in which it's possible to critique existing configurations of power and elaborate alternatives through the construction of new knowledges, new subjectivities, new practices and ways of life. But I guess in my work, I haven't wanted to address any of this through art, partly because I don't really know enough about it, and I've got colleagues such as Carolina who are far better placed to do this with art than I am. But I also want to see if it's possible to construct such new subjectivities and new agential practices in other spheres too. Next slide. So literature is important in this respect because, as we know from Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who's someone who's part of Open Humanities Press, and his book, Decolonizing the Mind, literature is a powerful instrument in evolving the cultural ethos of a people. But I don't just focus on literature in my work. Rather, the people I work with and myself are producing a variety of forms of intervention that are responding to particular issues across a number of different sites. Forms of intervention that might be associated with the university and the practice of academics and theorists, but also where's needs be with those working in the fields of activism, urbanism, education, business, politics, technology, or the media. And the aim of these interventions is to disarticulate the existing play field, its orthodoxy, and to foster instead a variety of antagonistic spaces that are neither simply liberal nor neoliberal, that can, where appropriate, contribute to the development of counter institutions and counter environments. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you for the introduction. Just before we start our conversation, I just wanted to remind everyone that we will open the conversation to the floor after a short interaction between myself and Gary. But in the meantime, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to submit them via the chat button that you will see on the bottom of the screen. Also, alternatively, you can ask the questions directly to Gary when we come to the Q&A, and you can do so by raising your hand. There's again a button on the bottom of the screen that you can press and to ask your question. Okay, so Gary, I would like to start, as you started your presentation, actually, first things first. And there's definitely a very interesting correlation that you are doing throughout the argument between inequities in British education and also a certain maintenance of an impoverished cultural scene, cultural here in a broad sense, although you focus later in the book more on literature, you are very much setting up what is the paradigm, let's say, of cultural production and circulation in this context. And you described that paradigm as being, and I'm quoting you, uncritically realist, humanist, and anti-intellectual. So I wanted to ask you if you could say a bit more about what you mean by anti-intellectualism, and specifically about the manifestations of this intellectualism within the context of British society.
Okay, no, thanks for that. Yeah, I guess, as I said in the short presentation, what I'm interested in is those moments where you can disarticulate something and transform it and then put together in a different form. You wouldn't keep it like that. You might have to keep that process going. And I guess one of them is certain common sense ideas, in particular to do with difficulty and complexity and intellectual life. And that, I know that's something, Caroline, that's something that you and I kind of talked about. It seems to be something about certain elements of English culture where confronted particularly by something that's difficult, a piece of writing, for example, that is difficult, the tendency can often be, see that as a challenge or a threat or a provocation. It's, you know, why is this elitist, arrogant intellectual assaulting me with their complex language and abstract thoughts? It's not, I mean, an alternative could be, this sounds interesting, I don't really know much about it, maybe I'll go away and research about it or think about it. And it's very much that kind of pushing back. I'm just kind of curious about that, about English culture. And obviously, you know, if you can trace back, you can do a history, you can do it back to, you know, the kind of intellectuals and who was doing intellectual work. And one version of that history would be, it's kind of the amateur gentleman scholar. I kind of always like the kind of the idea. I found in one of the books on kind of English public schools, and that people from a certain background and who were going to those schools, they didn't want to be seen as professionals. Professionals was what tradesmen were. They wanted to be these kind of amateur gentlemen. So they didn't want to be, in that sense, kind of professional, have a professional or language. It had to be something that was kind of amateur, that you didn't need, you know, almost didn't need to do too much work. And you can see that all the way through, right up to present day, and the things I was talking about in public school education, where it wasn't done to be seen to be too clever. It wasn't done to be seen to be in the library reading books. You've always got Boris Johnson's famous insult to David Cameron of being a girly swat because he got a first and Johnson got a 2-1. Believe he got a 2-1. But you know, he was seen as too academic. And so you kind of see this, you know, you still see it. Most again, I like the quote in the book where, you know, most of our Olympic sports people, maybe about half of them have been through public schools. It's that emphasis on sport rather than the kind of intellectual life. And I'm kind of just wondering, I guess, you know, who's that serving and whose interest that is. Partly it's kind of boring. Partly it's, you know, it's, as I was saying in the presentation, it's prevent people from asking difficult questions, from challenging, from saying, you know, do we have to take this for granted? Can we approach this a different way? And we can see with, you know, the pandemic, the way we've been organizing things isn't working. This idea that we don't need to support people in the NHS, we don't need to support key workers in society, it's made us very vulnerable. We're going to have to ask some difficult questions. We're going to have to ask difficult questions around the environment. When I was talking and mentioning Olga Tokarczuk and that feeling that we all got to give our individual narratives, but that has the effect of treating the outside world as this some sort of alien, some sort of other. And what that means with the environment, it is too easy to slip into treating it as an object, as resources. So we're going to have to ask some difficult questions. And that gets us into some of the things that have been using the language of post-humanism or anti-humanism or inhumanism to try and break that down. But that's complicated. It's challenging for people. It's not easy. It's not easy for me. I've been kind of, apart from seeing my life flash before my eyes, I've been nervous about today because to try and articulate some of this without falling back too much into habits or that kind of common sense language is difficult. It's difficult to keep that rigor up all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and something else you argue in the book is that, in a way, that anti-intellectualism is perpetrated by also the elite in order to keep those sophisticated cultural tools and ruses and political imagination even at bay, if I understand your argument well. So. So moving more to some of the gestures that you use in your argument, especially the focus on literature, and you focus specifically on three authors, and I'm going to mention them just for those of you that haven't read the publication yet. So it's Tom McCarthy and Didier Eribon and Édouard Louis, but mainly on Tom McCarthy's work, right? And you do something very interesting because you are looking at the memoir, the genre of the memoir in literature, and concatenating and relating that to the figure of the author, and how these two elements are absolutely crucial for your argument as describing the cultural apparatus as you just discussed before in the first question. So there's something interesting going on in the argument because you use a kind of a double bind argument with Tom McCarthy's work, because you are incredibly complimentary at the beginning, where do you describe, well, let me just kind of what I took away from the publication is that you are quite complimentary at the beginning, where you describe the work as kind of deconstructing the authorial figure of the artist, of the writer, of the writer, so that individuality that is producing the work. But at the same time, and further down the line in the argument, you say that you criticize how the author actually doesn't apply the same principles that he's using within his writing when it comes to issues around authorship, piracy, and copyright. And we know, knowing your work, that this, especially piracy and copyright, is something that you have dedicated a lot of thinking and a lot of practice as well to. And that's where you try to push a bit, I think, the critique of the work of Tom McCarthy's forward, and also identify what you then define being a liberal humanism approach. And I wanted to, which focus necessarily, well, not necessarily, but, our argument goes that it's based on the idea of this transparent individual, this idea of the natural self instead of a constructed one. So I wanted to ask you how you see this liberal humanism playing out in relation to our work in the humanities today, specifically in academia.
I think that was so rich, that question. There's so many bits I wanted. Yeah, I mean, I feel a bit bad about being. I'm glad you saw that I wasn't too harsh to Tom McCarthy, at least in the beginning. Dave Boothroyd, who was on the call, he kind of, when he read it, he was saying, well, if he's got a sense of humor, he'll laugh, and if he hasn't, he'll cry. But I am kind of, I say pirating because when I take the notion of the pirate, it's kind of from the classical notion, which is someone that kind of teases and challenges and it's kind of slightly provocative around things. And so I'm kind of, I'm teasing and challenging and trying to work with that text. And so that's one way that I'm trying not to just reproduce. I'm not trying to say, well, I've got my argument and there's Tom McCarthy's and we're going to battle it out, these two separate things. I'm kind of trying to weave my way through it by taking, I'm very much taking his argument and his argument about repetition and determinant and kind of remixing it. And I'm trying to say, okay, but if you kind of follow that through, this is what it ends up as. So you can kind of push it through. So he is kind of critical of the contemporary emphasis on the individual. So both Eribon and Louis, I very much like them. I'm very much enthused by their attempt to rethink theory, so it's more vital, more contemporary for the present world. So it's not just this harking back to some 1960s moment of Lacan or Foucault. So I very much like that, but they're still very much focused on the memoir. And that memoir falls into what I was using Tokarczuk to talk about, that kind of, we're still talking from our own personal positions. In McCarthy, he associates that with neoliberalism, he associates that with consumerism, which I kind of like that argument, but by pursuing him, if you like, all the way through to the end of his argument, you can see that he doesn't really evade any of that. He's kind of trapped in it as well. And so what I'm trying to do is, this book is trying to think through some of those problems, and it's thinking, where do we need to go next after that? If there's a problem about acting as that kind of an author, even a modernist European avant-garde author, you've still got that. I know people in the art space see it with around the way artists act, but you've still got that's romantic almost version of the genius. If you don't want that, if you don't want to have that very traditional notion of the book, if you don't want to adhere to copyright, where are we going to go? And so what I'm trying to do is kind of push towards the end of that. Not to say that I've got the answers. I mean, the book's published on with no copyright, and the idea of that is to kind of just loosen things up and say, well, in my world, it's hard to get people even to do Creative Commons, and I've got lots of problems with Creative Commons. I don't think it's very radical at all. It's certainly not commons. But I'm trying to say, look, we can loosen this up. Now, I'm saying that everyone should be publishing on a no copyright basis, but maybe we can kind of just loosen that up and then work out something different beyond that. So I'm kind of thinking, and partly why I wanted to start with tonight with the Arturo Escobar book. I mean, what would be to write in a kind of that more pluralistic manner that he talks about, or he talks about in terms of ontological politics or more relational? What would that actually be to kind of enact that in the way that we work? That's what I'm trying to explore next in the next book. Yeah.
And you also do that not only in terms of the copyrights for the book, as you just mentioned, also part of the argument, but something that is very interesting is that at the beginning you mentioned, and further down the argument as well, you tell the reader that the words you are using are not only yours. So you also deploy a method of copying, pirating, appropriating, and rewriting others' words and texts as part of the say the materiality of the writing, and which complicates in a way the authorship that is being kind of put forward, but also this idea of the solid monolithic author in a way. And I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a bit more, if it's not spoilers, obviously, but if you could tell us a bit more about these less visible gestures, because we are told every now and then, I think there are two moments in the publication where you do mention that, but it's not necessarily highly visible where those copying, repeating, remixing gestures are taking place. And if you could tell us a bit more of how you see the role of those gestures in the process of thinking about precisely the plurality, going back to Escobar's proposition, the plurality of the I beyond individualism, if we could articulate something like this.
Yeah, I mean, it's deliberate that I don't always make it clear, because the idea is for people to be unsure as to whether it's me that's speaking or writing, or Tom McCarthy or someone else. My favorite example of this, and this kind of what mass media, how the book, it's a kind of companion to this, how that came about. So I gave a talk. There was an event to celebrate 20 years of Mark America, and if I'm getting this right, a publication is probably on here, so he'd be able to correct me, called Grammatron. And before that, I'd been asked to look at a review copy of his book, his latest book, which was Remix the Context. So in my talk that was presenting at this 20-year anniversary celebration, I kind of remixed his book that no one else in the audience had kind of seen. So the idea was to kind of play with people's, they wouldn't know whether what I was saying was mine, whether it was Mark's, whether it was someone else's. And that's kind of that idea of weakening those boundaries around that individual I. It's just one way. I mean, another way we do it is we work in larger groups a lot of the time. We work in larger collectives or just teams of people, but also we count in those teams. We'd be thinking about the technology and other kind of agents as being contributing to that. And can we make that? Can we acknowledge that in some ways? Can we include that, kind of notions of authorship, which is why I like the Treeball project of kind of, can we acknowledge trees for the labor that they give us, and what would that be? How can we do it? And that's why I was using all those examples of where examples of nature and the environment have been given human rights, and it's saying, look, we've got to treat those as potential agential actors in their own right. So other projects are doing things like, can you write with nature? Can you get the environment to write with you? Would they be, can they be co-authors? And what does that do for our notions of creativity and originality and the boundaries for text, all those kind of things? That's what I'm going to be looking at a little bit in the mass media book.
But Gary, there's we know as well that the critique of the author or even the proposals around the construction of the figure of the author are not necessarily new, and we can draw ideas from, for instance, post-structuralists. We have Hollenbach as well in the 60s writing about the death of the author. We have also Foucault, Derrida, and a lot of other also continental philosophers exploring that, and a lot of contributions from post-colonial studies as well, such as Escobar and other modernity, coloniality scholars. So why do you think that this persists so much? Why are we always having to have this conversation over and over again? And again, something that I mentioned before, but just to, I think, remind you of that particular question is, what are the challenges in academia? Because we know that academia still relies very much on the notion of the author and originality. And this is what you are also, in a way, questioning and problematizing. Mm-hmm. So how do you relate to those challenges?
It's very difficult. It's very difficult to shift people. So other projects we've done are things around liquid and living books, which are books that are on wikis, that anyone could come in and play with the text, change it, rewrite it, do what they like with it. But no matter how much we tell people that you're free to do this, no matter how much people have read Roland Barthes and Foucault and the death of the author and what is an author and all those, people are very, very, find that very difficult. I find it very difficult to do, very difficult to give it up. But it's the way our society is constructed, isn't it? It's even, that's why I'm kind of talking a lot about the kind of post-humanists. You'd think that they'd be the people that would want to push that the most, but they don't. They flip back into it. So, the previous book, I had a chapter on Rosie Braidotti, but she has this notion of the post-human humanities study. She still wants to stay with the humanities. It's very seductive. It's nice. It's nice being thinking of as original or special or unique, or you're doing something important, and we get a lot of our reward for it. I can turn this kind of stuff into, into a career. I've been fortunate, I'm furious about the world, but I've found a niche where I can kind of channel that fury and make it appear like it's creative, or make it appear, my university would like to think of it in terms of innovation or disruption. You can kind of channel it in those ways, and those ways seem acceptable, and they can cope with that. I suppose I'm always somewhere blurring that boundary, but trying to want to push that little bit further, so it's not just that creative industries notion of disruption or innovation. We're trying to push it a bit further, but it's very hard. It's very hard to do it. It's very a lot of the people here are kind of doing it with us in small and different ways. That's really exciting, but it's naive to think that the world is going to be waiting for this. And it's kind of one of the things I've talked about in the past is I don't really feel I have anybody that I'm, apart from you lot, I don't have anybody that I'm actually writing for. I don't feel like I've got a people or a public, or I'm writing for this group. I'm kind of feel more that it's a missing group that I'm almost trying to create. I'm trying to nudge this group into being, if you like, through setting up various institutions or organizations or structures, and trying to nudge it in that kind of direction. It's kind of a similar way to the way that Eribon and Louis talk about. They don't know who they're writing for either. They don't know it because they've moved from the working class to the middle class, and they don't feel they belong to either of those. I'm kind of saying something a little bit different to that, but there's certainly something in that.
I think in terms of sorry.
No, that was it.
I think if you agree, Gary, there's already a question on the chat box, and I think it actually relates very nicely with what you were just saying in terms of the positionality or situatedness of who is saying what into whom. And so the question is from Cornelia. Does it make a difference who is appropriating from whom in terms of power relations?
Hello, Cornelia. Yes, it does make a difference. Yes, of course it does. I'm trying to think of one of the different ways that we can answer that. And obviously, you know, we want to, in some of the groups that we're talking about and working, and so if we set up organizations, so one of the things we do is things like Open Humanities Press, which is trying to be a space where we can still produce difficult work, philosophy, theory, around the Anthropocene, around art, Jonas' book on AI, and still trying to have a space in culture where you don't get that so much. I remember when, I'm old enough to remember when high street bookshops still had philosophy sections, and even sections on psychoanalysis, and you don't get that anymore, but we're still trying to make this kind of work available to people who want it around the world. But it wouldn't be for us. One of the things about kind of something like open access, making your work available like that, you know, obviously being taken up by neoliberal governments. They want to pump out the knowledge, the expertise of the UK or the US or maybe Europe. And so it matters who's actually spreading this. We don't want to do this. We have a kind of, we base it, well, my colleague Yannicka Adame came up with a phrase of scaling small, but it's also coming from Anna Singh's, you know, The Mushroom at the End of the World kind of book, this idea of want to keep things, well, she calls it non-scaling, we're kind of using that scaling small. So we wouldn't want to be expanding something like Open Humanities Press, so that we take over the world, we grow bigger, we kind of incorporate in it. What we're doing is we want to kind of non-scale it or scale it small. So we'd only increase it if we could take on another element that would kind of challenge us. But what we'd want is to say, well, you've got our text, you've got our infrastructure, you've got our software, you can take that and go and do it in different parts of the world. So someone like D'Souza Santos would call it more in terms of working with people rather than, you know, writing about them. It would be like less of that extractivist kind of space. So yeah, it really matters. It really matters as who's doing this, who's saying this. And that was another reason why I was kind of engaging with someone like Tom McCarthy. It's kind of had a slide with detailing all that awards he's up for. You can kind of take me teasing him, I think. You can take me pirating. He's kind of reasonably secure in that. But yeah, there were other people that I wouldn't. It's not for me to kind of engage with. Would some of these still similar issues I'm talking about, would they be in different areas of society? And I'd feel a bit less comfortable about doing that. Whereas someone like Tom McCarthy, he's kind of more in the center of things. So I don't feel so uncomfortable about. Was a comedian say punching upwards?
I just want to remind everyone that you can use the chat box for questions, but also you can press on reactions and raise your hand if you want to ask a question directly to Gary, just unmuting your mic as well. So we have already, we have another question, and this is from Benjamin Meyer Folks. Benjamin, do you want to ask the question directly, or do you want me to read it?
Here he comes.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank you and congratulate you on this important conversation. And the question has to do with the possibility of considering that there's a wider history of militancy in favor of so-called common sense and keeping things simple in the English language more widely. That of course includes but exceeds the Oxbridge phenomenon. And I'm thinking, of course, very broadly in terms of comparisons with what happens in French, German, Italian, Spanish. And of course, this is a massive topic and there's nothing simple about it at all. But I was wondering what your sense was, both of you and colleagues, in this respect. Might there be a need to think in terms of a wider intellectual and cultural history of the English language to put all of this in a wider context?
Can you say a little bit more about that? That sounds interesting. But...
Well, I was thinking about how something like analytic philosophy comes about, culturally speaking, why there is such a divide traditionally with continental so-called philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I'm speculating in terms of the intellectual influence of Protestantism and its varieties. Although, of course, that is complex in the German case. So, for example, in Spanish, we are very aware of the historical legacy of Counter-Reformation and the effect that has had on, for example, the lesser development of philosophical thoughts in Spanish from that period onwards, and how we need to look into literary developments and others to find the kind of complexity that you're putting into play with your critique, Gary. So, I mean, this is not something I've worked on, but I'm just trying to draw a parallel between our own questions in Spanish and your own relation with the English in this respect. And of course, you have other epicenters that are significant in this respect, like James Joyce and so on. So it's not a simple story in any way, but perhaps still keeping an eye on that.
Yes, it's not simple. Thanks. Cheers. No, and Caroline, you've been talking about this because I tried to be very careful in the book to talk about the English, because English culture kind of dominates Britain so much, and so it gets spread out. But then Scotland, Ireland, and Wales all have very different cultures, and so yes, Ireland has people like James Joyce and Beckett, which are kind of seen much more in that modernist avant-garde European kind of sense. This kind of sense that seems to have been lost in English literary culture. So one of the texts I could have talked about would have been Gabriele Josephovici's, Whatever Happened to Modernism, and he's kind of talking about Martin Amis and Ian McEwan and Julian Barnes, and they've kind of reacting against that European modernism. They really didn't want to get involved in it, and they've precisely done that much more, that more realist, kind of more sentimentalist kind of version. And in some ways, you can see that Stub and Fury is kind of almost an update of that kind of argument. Again, someone else is here, is Wojtek Drong's on here, and he had an argument. I only read it afterwards, where he's kind of talking about, well, Josephovici only had one chapter on people like James Joyce, Martin Amis and Julian Barnes, and it really wasn't enough to make it stick. It needed something a bit more. So sometimes when I'm feeling a bit bad about picking on Tom McCarthy, I kind of think, okay, so that's one reason you kind of needed something a bit more substantial to do it. But what you're really talking about is going to take a lot more research. The Jonathan Rose, The Intellectual Life of the Working Classes book, that goes into that a lot more. And there's a lot more of that history in England of Christianity, Methodism, and a kind of certain pragmatism that made them very suspicious of radical intellectuals, of kind of, why Marxism didn't necessarily take off among the working classes and things. But it's a longer history that I can't improvise just at the minute. We'll need to talk about it a bit more.
Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Gary. There's another question here from Patricia. Patricia, I would just ask the question if you want to ask the question yourself, or if I should read from the chat box. If you don't say anything, I would just go ahead. Okay. So Gary, this is a question. Is there a moment now, building on the work being done to decolonize the curriculum of the university study of literature, to bring the question of class into the literature curricula without shrinking it to a matter of diversity or inclusivity? I work at a University of Brighton, where many of our students come from working class backgrounds, and the class closet, in inverted commas, is not something we have yet found a way to integrate into the unlearning you argue, must be done. How would this be done? Could this be done for the study of literature?
Yeah, that's kind of very difficult. I don't know if you can see this. There's all these kind of recent books like this out at the moment, which are kind of talking about, people talking about race and gender and sexuality, but saying one of the things that's very hard to talk about is class in that. So yes, one of the things that's been good around something like the Black Lives Matter movement, it does seem to be a space where people are engaging. Again, kind of something we talked about is kind of that kind of, for a long time, that kind of engagement seemed to drop out of English culture. I always remember, people like David Beckham famously saying that he'd never read a book. When if you compare that to, we were talking about the Beatles or something like that, and the kind of the journey that they went on, kind of, one of them even married a kind of modern conceptual artist. There was a different trajectory at one point, whereas we seem to go through a period of years where people didn't want to engage with that kind of work. And now it seems with various movements, people are engaging with that, and it does seem a kind of a movement, a moment where we could have some leverage and bring some of those issues in. So yeah, it's kind of hopeful. We've got to try and make the use of it though, and the question is how to best do that. The decolonizing, one of the things I've been kind of reading and thinking about is, again, you've got to be careful about using those things, like those terms, and kind of universalizing them. I think they come out with specific history, specific cultural moments, and it's problematic to kind of just say, well, we can all get involved in that and do it. It needs to be kind of really carefully thought about. Perhaps not all of us should do that. Again, it goes back to Cornelia's question, or what I'm taking as Cornelia's question, is it matters who speaks and about what.
Thank you. There's a comment from Susan Fulmer. She's saying, thank you for this fascinating presentation and the conversation, particularly on the tendency of avoiding complexity in English writing language. And as a German, I'm pretty intrigued by this. I'm sorry that I have to leave for another event. Looking forward to reading the book.
Excellent.
Any other questions? Again, remember that you can just raise, oh, yes, I see.
Angela's got a hand physically.
Angela.
Then just, yeah, on mute. There we go.
Great.
Yeah, okay. Well, I was just about to put something into the chat box, and I really enjoyed your talk, Gary. And I'm just kind of thinking out loud here that Scotland is obviously so near. It is part of the United Kingdom, but its literature is actually dominated by an anti-realist working class voice.
Yeah.
And that continues to be the case, from James Kelman, Alistair Gray, Janice Galloway, Liv Lockhead. Poets and writers inhabit a kind of profoundly anti-realist, almost Beckettian kind of vernacular, and use language in a way that has been really very much exactly doing what you're saying cannot happen within the English kind of field, or the English, this tradition that you're describing. And I'm just, thinking that's so interesting, because obviously it percolates down into the English landscape. And of course, when James Kelman won the Booker Prize, there was a great uproar because he used the F word. And then, of course, along 5 years later, the Edinburgh writer, who I don't like, I've forgotten his name.
Okay. I know who you mean, but I can't say it. I can't remember it either.
You know how I mean, the drug addicts. Know,
Irving Welsh.
Irving Welsh, thank you. Exactly. Kind of corrupted that tradition, really, I would say.
Okay.
But anyway, I just wondered what you thought about the proximity of Irish and Scottish traditions, yet the extent to which they depart so profoundly, also in theatre, from what you're describing. And they look to Europe, and they look to the rest of the world.
Yeah. No, I'd be interested in what you thought, why you thought that was possible in Scotland, in the way it seems very difficult in England. In England, it seems a very kind of, it feels, I think even in one of the footnotes I was talking about, you get this anti-intellectual even in France, where it doesn't seem quite so deadening. Just it doesn't feel like, sometimes it feels like you've got a big duvet pressing on you, whereas maybe that isn't the case in Scotland or Ireland, and people can have a certain freedom even within that kind of language to, Kelman wasn't just swearing, he was kind of writing in dialect, wasn't it? It was quite difficult, but in a non-modernist, experimental way. It was very unique, very exciting. So you were going to say something.
I was just thinking, as a sociologist, with a kind of institutional frame, or with a Bourdieusian frame, about the different education system and the shrinking, the tiny number of public schools in Scotland, and the mass state school system, and the political culture.
And still even free university education.
So. And free, exactly.
Much different,
We have two immediate reactions to this point, Angela. Maybe I could read them out loud so that they can also dialogue with your points. So Catherine says, Angela's point is interesting, especially when you consider the impact of Scotland's emigres into Westminster. What is Scotland doing that England isn't? This is the question from Catherine, but also followed by Mel Jordan's question. Is it a resistance to England? And another reaction from Catherine, and St. Andrews is the home of university culture. Gary, do you want to comment on this?
I can only agree with it. Maybe I count as kind of, I mean, because again, we shouldn't say that England's all the same in uniform either. I mean, there are different parts of it in different regions, and I come originally from a part that was quite close to Scotland, so there's how much there is in that as well. It would be kind of interesting to explore, but that sort of thing is very complicated, and it needs a lot of thought and working through. And I was a little, I mean, it wasn't meant to be a big book in the first place, so I tried to be very careful about not saying this about Scotland and Ireland and Wales, because I do know the culture is very different, and in lots of respects much more interesting. So I was happy to stick it to the English.
So while we wait for other questions, maybe I have just a comment in relation to that, which is if we could think that beyond this kind of more nation state paradigm, if we could think of what you describe as being uncritically humanist, realist, and intellectualist, if we can think of that as fitting into a particular political program, and if so, what would that be? What are the why are these not sure, I'm not sure Gary's still with us.
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, he disappeared.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. For some reason he disappeared from my screen.
I think you've just moved over on the screen.
Zoom is playing tricks on us. So I was just thinking if we could think as being sort of mechanisms, as Foucault would say, mechanisms of kind of a larger political program, if you know what I mean.
Wow.
And if so, what could that be?
I don't know. I don't know if that's really for me to kind of work out. I always like Foucault's comment when he was asked whether he was writing for the student protesters of 1968, and he was kind of saying, well, I'm not writing for them, I'm writing in terms of them. So I kind of think that some of the work I do is in terms of some of these political or social changes, but I'm not writing for any particular political movements or parties in that kind of way. I do think we are seeing some of the results of not having, it doesn't have to be, not the loss of theory or philosophy sections in bookshops, but the general willingness to be critical. It was interesting after the storming of the Capitol building on January 5th, was it, of this year? And there were even politicians in America saying, we need to teach people and educate them to being more critical, so they're just not believing conspiracy theories, they're not getting whipped up so much. In our case, they wouldn't believing all the stuff about the NHS around Brexit and things like that. So we're kind of seeing some of the impact of not having part of that so prominent in our culture. So it'd be interesting to see if we can kind of get some of that back. The glass half full of me thinks we're just going through a moment. We're going through a moment where things have loosened up, and even Trump and Brexit and Boris Johnson, that crowd, are just, as things loosen up, they've been able to take advantage of it. But maybe we'll move to something on the other side. Maybe we'll move to something that's a lot more considerate, that's a lot more caring in terms of the environment, in terms of how we organize ourselves past the pandemic. There's all the kind of, the municipal socialism movements in cities. move for a universal basic income, which is not too far away to how we're responding to the pandemic. People experiment with platform capitalism, cooperativism, I mean, all those kind of things. The glass half full of me thinks, yeah, we'll move to that in the future. And maybe we can kind of help nudge things along, prepare the grounds, support people, create opportunities for that.
Gary, we have a question from Jagdish Patel. Jagdish, do you want to unmute your mic?
Hi, Gary. That was really interesting. See, I've come into the university from the community, so it's quite interesting to see actually that the people here are still having the same conversations that we're having in the community in a way, and it's not that different. And I think that passion is there. I don't think you need to be too pessimistic. Kelman launched his book, I can't remember, in the late 90s, the one that won the book out, in a community centre in Southall. And he came down to London with a whole collection of Scottish writers and poets, bottles of whiskey, and the Indians turned up with bottles of whiskey, and people basically got drunk, talked about poetry, read and talked about politics. And I think that passion is still there. You know, the stories you get in the intellectual life of the working classes, that passion in that history, I think is still there.
Yeah,
it's more difficult now, but I think, and part of the reason it's difficult is because the Glasgow Scot writers have publishing houses. They have a network of people talking, connecting together and supporting each other, and that communal sense of writing, thinking, and is more difficult now because the publishing wing of it is gone. I think in a different way. But there is a history of those autodidact writers in working class communities who aren't really celebrated in the same way. And I know in anti-racism, there's people like Malcolm X and C.R. James that people talk about and study, but not necessarily in the curriculum. And it's unless people get to university, I don't think a lot of people will necessarily know about it but they talk about it through probably hip hop type stuff nowadays, I think. And some of what you're saying sounds a bit like a hip hop artist, to be honest. In the mix of the mashing. But I think that stuff is there. But it has the university sectors expanded. But I think it kills the confidence of working class kids to talk and do things in the way that the punk movement maybe did and talked about. And I think there's some link between the two, that as people get more educated, they become less writing stuff.
Why would you say that? I'm interested in that. That seems, you'd think expanding it to nearer 50% everyone going to universities would be a good thing.
Yeah, because the kids I talk to are scared to write an essay in case they're going to get criticised to do it if they don't do it in the right way. Whereas we try and bring out the passion and bring out I think it's trying to bring out people's voices to say what they want to say. Yeah. In an articulate way, and I think that's quite difficult to do, and that takes a lot of confidence, I think, for a lot of kids. The other point I wanted to make is that link that you make between humans and nature and all that stuff does exist in other cultures like Hinduism and Buddhism.
Of course, yeah.
But it's not that replicable or applicable in urban areas. Like you couldn't go to Amazon workers and use Hinduism, really, and in the same way. And I think there are some really interesting ideas which have never really been drawn out in a lot of Western writing, but there's something there that's worth exploring, I think.
Yeah, but one of the arguments around gig economy workers is that they already are inanimate objects. They're just they're humans that are being treated like the robots that they're going to be replaced by, aren't they? They're already kind of like that. So there's, you can apply, it's not exactly the same, but you can kind of see that this half human, half technological hybrid, which have been even timed when they go for breaks and toilet breaks and stuff like that. And yeah, and there's all the arguments around, do we need to think of something like class very differently? Is there more in common with people who are doing work for Amazon or Deliveroo or Uber and the state of people at university, particularly people, early career researchers who are starting out and much more precarious and much more working? We don't call it gig work, but it's more or less that's what it is. So do we need to kind of reconfigure all those things? Yeah.
Thank you, Jagdish. There's a comment from Ibrahim. I can see Ibrahim also. I don't know if you wanted to share your comment with us or if I should read just from the chat box. I'm going to read. Yeah, okay. So I don't know if this is a question or interpretation. I assume keeping things simple, in inverted commas, is not as threatening as keeping things simple as the only possible modality. At least this is what's happening here in Cyprus at the moment. Gary, do you want to say something?
About keeping things simple. It's not that I'm kind of, I've got, everything has to be really complicated. Obviously, you have to be able to choose different modalities for different situations. What I'm kind of interested in English culture in particular is this aversion to difficulty, and you can see it particularly in literature and an aversion to certain kinds of forms of modernism or experimental work. You can see it in journalism, where they just completely, I mean, you just see it in endless repetition, this kind of tick of anything that's academic, anything that has footnotes in it, anything that might be more kind of abstract. And it didn't used to be like that. I was reading something and someone was kind of talking and talking about my history and relating it to kind of theory in the 80s or something. But, that's one version of my history through Sussex and things like that. But another history would be through the British music press of late 70s, 1980s, when people were talking about people like Chris Daver or Bart, or they had that, that was just in music papers that lots and lots of people bought. So it was kind of there, and it wasn't seen as, it was seen as a fashionable thing. It was seen as a kind of trying to make it a cool thing. It wasn't seen as a threat or as a something that should be avoided. It was seen as, it made you want to go out and read some more, as everyone always said about David Bowie. I mean, he kind of picked all these kind of different references, but it made a whole generation of people want to go and read different kind of stuff, William Burroughs or Nietzsche or those kind of things, which is maybe that part of that is coming back a little bit now. But as I say, it felt for a long time that it was missing. It's difficult.
I'm aware of time as well. This is 8:20. Shall we get one more question? If there is one more question. Yes. We have a question from Farana Kabn. What do you think about the experimental way in which cinema reified Tom McCarthy's Remainder in a movie? If you have seen the movie, I would like to know what you think about Omar Fast's work and how he has taken this complex novel with its deep engagement with cultural theory and processed it through the individualist narrative structures and well-worn formal language of dominant cinema.
That's an easy question to answer because I haven't seen the film. What do you think? You tell me about it.
Farnak, do you want to switch on your mic?
Hi, thank you so much for a great discussion. Well, actually, I haven't seen the movie either, but I saw a lot of pictures, and in a few weeks in our PhD course, we are going to discuss it. We've been reading it. And yeah, so I kind of wanted to know what's going on in that movie, because apparently there are also some critics about how an artist with little experience in cinema has got this this complicated story and made a visual, very impressive visual version of it.
Yeah. I really like the idea that we talk about a film that neither of us have seen. Somehow that really appeals. But perhaps we shouldn't go there. I kind of felt, I suppose, after I'd read all the novels and I read the kind of non-fiction of Tom McCarthy, I needed a little bit of a break. But I do now feel ready, and I will go and watch the film. Yeah, that sounds really interesting.
Thank you. So, Gary, if you agree, I'll bring the session to a close.
Yes, that's
yes.
Really,
so thank you so much for talking us through some of the complicated and welcoming, because of that as well, ideas you elaborate in your publication around liberal humanism, contested figure of the author, the advocacy for an anti-bourgeois theory and practice. I would just like to bring your attention as well to an upcoming event at the Center for Post-Digital Cultures as part of the network, Post-Digital Intimacies Network. This is on the 29th of April. Failed Intimacies is the title, and it's organized by Dr. Adrian Evans. If you want to find more information, there will be hopefully a link in the chat box, else is postdigitalintimacies.net, where you can find more about the event. For also more events organized by Coventry University, visit our events page, and this is coventry.ac.uk/events related to the Center for Post-Digital Cultures as well. Finally, I would like to thank Catherine Thompson-Goodwin, Olga Baker, and Holly Turpin for organizing the event with us. And I guess there is only one thing left for me to do, and I hope you can join me online in thanking Gary for the talk, and also congratulations on this publication. Thank you so much, Gary.
I'm sorry we didn't have any whiskey. That would have been a very nice idea, or something.
Next time.
Next time. It's really
Absolutely.
nice to see everyone. It'd be really nice to just talk and not have to talk about the book. That would be really, just talk to each other. That would be really good. Thanks all for coming. Really enjoyed it. Thanks
I wish you enjoyed the reading as well, and have a lovely evening. Thank you.
See you all soon, yeah?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gary. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Olga.